So 6 years ago, I was working a lot with Wendy and with Sam, sometimes with Myron, Sheila, Mike, and oftentimes they would talk about things like patterns and fractals and differences and containers and exchanges, and it's like they were speaking Chinese, which I didn't understand. And I was like, I want to know that language. And I eventually realized that language comes from human systems dynamics. So I took Glenda's training about human systems dynamics 6 years ago, and I wanted to be able to understand them. And I wanted to apply the practices of noticing patterns and influencing those in my work as a consultant with organizations and in influencing patterns in communities to be more just and sustainable. And I didn't know at that time that a few years after that, I'd be applying the same practices after getting a diagnosis of terminal brain cancer. And Glenda sometimes talked about the practices of HSD are in a way most useful if it's a situation where you don't have a lot of control, you can't predict too much. And when I got this diagnosis of the most aggressive kind of brain cancer and learned there was no cure for it, and that on average people died 18 months after diagnosis, even with the normal treatments, that situation felt like I don't have a lot of control, can't predict much, it feels intractable. And I remember Glenda saying, if a situation feels intractable, this means you can kind of shift your perspective, find a new angle, a new level to influence patterns. Well, I wanted that. That sounded better than chemo and death. So I did the standard treatment for my diagnosis, even though it's not very promising. Brain surgery, and then chemo and radiation together. And one day when I was doing the chemo and radiation, I noticed some liquid coming out of my head where the incision was from the surgery. And I eventually realized it was spinal fluid leaking out because the incision hadn't fully healed yet. And so what I eventually did is I went to the hospital, and a kind and scary doctor stuck a tube into the lower part of my back, threaded it up my spine, and then for about a week, I was on a bed in the hospital, laying right on top of that thing sticking up my spine, connected to a machine that would drain the spinal fluid out of my back in hopes that that would take the pressure off the wound up here and it could heal. After several days in the hospital in that uncomfortable position, I was awake in the middle of the night. It's about 2 a.m. I couldn't sleep. And I was thinking a lot about patterns, but it wasn't helpful thinking. Sam mentioned the spiral, but I was doing a very downward spiral. And my imagination of thinking I'm on a free fall through different symptoms and side effects that get treatments, and then those treatments lead to other side effects, in a free fall through side effects and symptoms to death, and felt just knotted up in my belly. And I knew that if the leaking of spinal fluid didn't stop, I'd need another brain surgery to put in a shunt, which might lead to another infection. So I felt stuck in that free fall. And I thought I heard someone come in the room, and there were nurses that would come in oftentimes and adjust the machine, sucking the spinal fluid out, increase it or decrease it. And I looked around, but I didn't see anybody that came in the room. And then I thought I heard a voice. Again, I looked around, didn't see anybody. And after you've been in the hospital several days, some strange things can happen. And then, to my surprise, I was sure that I saw and heard Martin Luther King Jr. come up next to my hospital bed, kneel at my bed, call me son, which I appreciated because we never had that kind of intimate relationship. It was more like a distant admiration relationship. But he felt very close. And then he delivered to me the end of the speech he gave the night before he died. And he knew then that his life was very much in danger and that there were many death threats against him. And he saw his own death coming. And in Memphis that night, as well as at my bedside, he told me the end of his speech, which was something like, we've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now. I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but it really doesn't matter with me now because God's allowed me to go to the mountaintop. And I've looked over, and I know that I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. Because mine eyes have seen the glory, and all I want to do now is do God's will. And as Dr. King breathed this into me at the hospital bed, he breathed in a different kind of pattern logic into me, a phrase that Clinda uses. That he was able to see beyond the pattern of his own individual life into the larger patterns, as he would say, of building the beloved community. And to rest in the joy and surrender that comes from belonging to and surrendering to those larger patterns. And as he breathed that into me, he helped me know that even if I don't get to see my kids graduate from high school, even if I don't get to grow old with my wife, if I don't get to see our country get out of this fearful time, that we as a people will get to the promised land. And that if I am faithful as he was to the small steps I'm asked to do, I can also surrender into those larger patterns with joy. I eventually went to sleep that night in the hospital. And a couple days later, the spinal fluid dripping out of my head, it did stop coming out. And I was able to go home. And it's been more than 2 years since that night in the hospital. And almost all of those days, I've felt good, and I think I have been alive all those days. And I've had lots of opportunities to notice and feel and see how I belong to those larger patterns and see how I can contribute to them while I'm alive. And that, as Sam told the stories, that death doesn't stop those patterns, it just changes them. And the pattern outside of myself that's most immediate to me, most meaningful, is the way I influence and contribute to the patterns of my 2 children. And that I so much long to be there, to be here with them as they grow into adults. 16 years ago, this summer, my first child was about to be born, thanks to my wife. And I was with some friends in Philadelphia about a month or two before our first child was born, and I had a meltdown with these friends because I was terrified that the emotional patterns in my life would be passed down to and constrain this child who was about to be born. And that the shyness in my life and the ways fears kept me withdrawn from life, afraid to fully engage. I was terrified that would limit this child being born. But when my son was born, a couple months later, I was in the hospital and I picked him up when he was slimy and crying for the first time. And of course, as I did hold him, he changed the emotional patterns in my life from that first moment. And now, 16 years later, that little baby is here making a video of our event. And at 16, he is exponentially more engaged with life than I was at 16. Creatively, in his vision, in his relationships, in his heart. And he has taught me that the patterns we receive are not cages we have to live in, but platforms we can jump off of. About 2 years ago, when I finished all the medical treatment that was available, a bunch of surgeries, chemo, radiation, clinical trials, a bunch of stuff, I still knew my prognosis wasn't good. Most people still died within months in that situation. And so I decided I was going to do something every day to support my health and well-being outside of the medical system. And I decided to go sit next to the Mississippi River every day out of a trust that if I noticed and felt the ways I belonged to the broader patterns of that watershed and that beautiful place, that might trickle down to my healing and hopefully in other directions too. And one part of my practice of going to the river is that with the people closest to me in my life, together we have found particular spots along the river that are our shared place. With my kids, with my wife. And my son and I, we picked a place not too far from here. It's a little hidden part of a cliff looking over a bend in the river. And you can see 4 miles of the river from there. I measured it recently. And I went there several times in the past couple weeks preparing for today. And Wendy, I remember saying many times that oftentimes it's useful to go up to the balcony, look out over the dance floor, notice the patterns, then go back down to the dance floor, try out some new moves, see how that shifts the patterns, go back up to the balcony. So when I'm on the cliff, that is my spot, my son and I picked out, it's a balcony for me or a mountaintop, as Dr. King said. And I can see and feel the ways I'm a part of the Mississippi River, that water that lives in me, and I can watch the herons and the eagles fly up and down over the river and fly with them. And know that I'm just one part of a larger pattern of my ancestors and my descendants, both literally and metaphorically. And across the river from that cliff spot, there's a spot my wife and I picked out together that's at the bottom of the gorge, right next to where the water goes past. And my wife has been in the bottom of the valley with me in the last 3 years. That when I've been throwing up from intense pain, She's emptied my puke bowls, brought them to me clean. When I've had IV bags I had to change at home, she's changed them with me. And when I sit at the bottom of that gorge with my wife or by myself and feel the water rushing over me, feel the cancer washing over me, breaking me open, I feel more opened to life and to death. And so today, I ask you, what are the places, the people, and the practices that take you up to the balcony and the mountaintop to see and feel the bigger patterns you're a part of? And what are the things that move you into the river and the valley that open you up to the particulars of life and death?